The first time Graham Wallace noticed the boots, it was the winter of 1882, and the snow had come down so hard over the town of Harlan Creek, Wyoming, that the whole world looked like it had been scrubbed clean of everything ugly. But when Cora Vaughn stepped off the general store's porch and into the muddy slush of Main Street, he saw them plain as anything. Those cracked leather boots with the heel on the left one worn down to almost nothing and the stitching coming loose at the toe. And something in his chest pulled tight in a way he could not quite name. Harlan Creek was not a large town by any measurement a reasonable person might use. It had a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that doubled as a barbershop on Sundays when old Pete Hawkins could be persuaded to pick up his shears, a church that had been built by the congregation 3 years prior and still smelled of new pine when the weather turned warm, and a post office that also served as the sheriff's office, because the town could only afford one man for one purpose, and Roy Dunbar had figured out how to serve both. There was a small schoolhouse at the eastern edge of the settlement, and beyond that, the open range stretched out until it swallowed itself in the distant purple mountains. Graham Wallace had come to Harlan Creek in the spring of 1880 with a string of horses he'd purchased down in Colorado, and a reputation for being the kind of man who kept his word. He was 26 years old then, lean and sun-darkened, with hands that were permanently calloused from rope work, and eyes the particular shade of gray that the sky turns just before a serious storm decides to announce itself. He had taken up work at the Fenner Ranch, which was the largest operation within 20 miles, and he had proven himself useful enough that, by the end of that first year, old Harlan Fenner had made him his head wrangler, which meant more responsibility but also a small cabin of his own at the edge of the property, and a salary that was modest but reliable. Cora Vaughn had come to Harlan Creek under different circumstances entirely. She had arrived in the summer of 1880, just a few months after Graham, though their arrivals had not overlapped in any meaningful way because Cora had come with nothing except a carpetbag, a young child clinging to her hand, and a look on her face that said she was not accustomed to asking for help and did not intend to start. She was 23 years old, and she had come from Kansas where her husband, a man named Elias Vaughn, had died of a fever that swept through their county the previous spring, and left her with a 5-year-old daughter named Pearl, and a farm that had already been mortgaged beyond what she could manage alone. She had sold what she could, packed what remained, and followed a letter she'd received from a distant cousin who claimed to have work for her in Wyoming, only to find that the cousin had moved on by the time she arrived, leaving only a forwarding address that pointed somewhere vague in the direction of Montana. Cora had stood in the street of Harlan Creek with her carpetbag and her daughter, and a look of such precise, controlled desperation that Margaret Lyle, who ran the boarding house on the north end of town, had taken one look at her and said, "You look like a woman who needs a room and a meal, and I look like a woman who needs someone to help with the washing, so come inside before the heat kills us both." That was how Cora Vaughn found her footing in Harlan Creek. She helped Margaret Lyle with the boarding house, the laundry, the cooking, the cleaning, in exchange for a room for herself and Pearl, and she took in mending and sewing from the other townspeople for what small wages she could earn. It was not a comfortable life by any generous definition of the word, but it was a life, and Cora Vaughn had learned early that a life, however difficult, was worth the labor of maintaining it. Graham Wallace first encountered her properly in the autumn of 1880, when he brought a load of wood to the boarding house that Harlan Fenner had arranged as payment for some service or another, and she had opened the back door and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes of hers and said, "Stack it against the south wall, please, away from the dampness," and then gone back inside without waiting to see if he would comply, because she was the kind of woman who gave a direction and expected it to be followed. He had stacked it against the south wall. He had thought about those steady eyes for 3 days afterward and then told himself sternly to stop being a fool. But the thing about Graham Wallace was that He was the kind of man who noticed things without saying anything about them. He noticed the way Cora managed the boarding house guests with a quiet authority that made even the rougher trail hands mind their manners. He noticed how she braided Pearl's hair every morning before school with a patience and tenderness that seemed to cost her something, and yet she gave it freely. He noticed when she went without so that Pearl could have what she needed, the way she would serve everyone else at Margaret Lyle's table before taking her own portion, always the smallest one. And he noticed the boots. He noticed them first that winter of 1882, as he had already established, when the snow was coming down, and she stepped off the porch and her left heel sank unevenly into the slush, because the leather was worn so thin on that side that it offered no real protection anymore. He had been on the other side of the street, outside the livery where he just left his horse, and he watched her walk and noticed the slight compensation in her gait, the way she automatically adjusted her weight to account for the imbalance, and he thought that she had been making that adjustment for a long time because it looked practiced, natural. Like something a person does when they've learned that the world is not going to fix itself for them, so they had better fix themselves for the world instead. He said nothing. He was not the sort of man who said things without knowing what to say, and he did not know what he would have said to her about her boots without it coming out wrong. Something that might have sounded like pity, and Cora Vaughn had the look of a woman who would accept a great many things from the world but not pity, not from anyone. So he said nothing and went about his work and kept noticing things about Cora Vaughn that he had no particular right to notice. It was Pearl who gave him his opening, in a way, though Pearl was entirely innocent of doing any such thing. Pearl Vaughn was 7 years old by then, and had her mother's serious eyes but a temperament that was somewhat sunnier, and she had taken a liking to Graham's horse, a big bay gelding named Tolliver, who was placid and patient and allowed small children to feed him apple cores without complaint. Pearl would sometimes stand at the fence of the livery and call to Tolliver in a low, earnest voice, and one afternoon Graham had walked past and found her there, holding out a wrinkled apple with both hands while Tolliver regarded her with his deep, liquid gaze. "He's thinking about it," Graham had said, stopping beside her, and Pearl had looked up at him with those serious eyes and said, "He always thinks about it first. I like that about him." Graham had found himself smiling at that. "I like that about him too." That had been the beginning of a careful, tentative friendship between Graham Wallace and Pearl Vaughn, which then by extension brought him into occasional proximity with Cora, who watched the friendship between her daughter and this quiet cowboy with the storm-gray eyes with a caution that was not quite suspicion, but was related to it. She had been careful with Pearl since Elias died. She was careful with herself. Caring too much, trusting too easily, those were luxuries she had learned she could not afford. But Graham Wallace did not push. He did not try to insert himself. He was simply there in the way that a solid fence post is there, reliable and unassuming, and easy to lean against without even quite noticing you're doing it. He taught Pearl the names of all his horses when she asked. He repaired the fence post on the western side of the boarding house yard without being asked, when he noticed it had begun to lean. He brought an extra portion of venison from a successful hunt to Margaret Lyle's door in November, and did not stay to be thanked. The second winter came, 1883, and the boots were still on Cora's feet. Graham noticed them again in January, when she was crossing to the general store and slipped on a patch of ice. She caught herself on the hitching post before she fell, and he was close enough to have reached out a hand, but she had already righted herself before he could take a step, and she looked at him with a flash of something in her eyes that might have been embarrassment and said, "The ice is treacherous today," in the tone of a woman who was not embarrassed at all and was simply making an observation about the weather. "It is," he agreed, and he looked at the boots. The left heel now so reduced it was barely there. The stitching at the right toe opened up into a gap he could see daylight through. And he thought about all the things a person's boots say about their circumstances, and all the things a person's circumstances say about the world they're living in and about whether that world is treating them fairly. And he concluded that the world had not been particularly fair to Cora Vaughn, but that she was making absolutely no concessions to that fact. He said nothing about the boots. But that evening, he found himself sitting with his saddle across his knees, doing the kind of methodical leather repair work he did when his hands needed something to do while his mind worked through a problem, and he thought about Cora Vaughn with a thoroughness that surprised him. He had been careful with his own feelings in the same way she was careful with hers. He recognized the tendency in her because he had it himself, learned from different causes but expressed in much the same way. His father had been a man who gave his trust too freely and had it broken repeatedly, and Graham had watched that happen throughout his boyhood and made his own private vow not to repeat the error. But there was a difference. He was beginning to understand between caution and cowardice, and he was not entirely sure which side of that line he was currently standing on. The winter of 1883 was also the winter that trouble came to Harlan Creek in the form of a man named Dec Harmon and his two associates, who had been drifting south from Montana and who had decided that Harlan Creek looked like an easy place to spend some time with other people's money. They were not violent men in the deliberate, calculating way of the truly dangerous. They were the more common variety of frontier trouble, men who were lazy and selfish, and had decided that taking things was easier than earning them, and who were capable of violence as a means to an end but preferred intimidation when it served the same purpose. Dec Harmon took a room at Margaret Lyle's boarding house, which meant he was under the same roof as Cora and Pearl, and this caused a particular quality of tension to settle into Graham Wallace's shoulders that he carried around for the 2 weeks Harmon stayed there. He made excuses to be in town more often. He stopped by the boarding house on small pretexts. He sat in the saloon where he could see the door and watch who came and went with the patience of a man who had spent a great deal of time waiting for things to happen. The trouble came on a Thursday evening in February, and it was smaller in its physical expression than Graham had feared, but larger in its emotional consequences. Harmon had been drinking, and he had come back to the boarding house and said something to Cora in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the dining room, something that Graham was not there to hear, but that Margaret Lyle witnessed, and Margaret Lyle described it afterward as the kind of remark that a decent woman should never have to hear under any roof she's helping to maintain. Cora had looked at Harmon with those steady dark eyes and told him quietly and precisely that if he spoke to her that way again, she would see to it personally that he found alternative lodgings by morning, and that in the meantime he could eat in his room. Harmon had not liked that, but there was something in Cora's voice when she said it, not loudness, not heat, just an absolute immovability that had caused him to reconsider his next move and go upstairs without further incident. Graham heard about this the following morning from Margaret Lyle herself, who reported it with the satisfied air of a woman retelling a scene of particular justice. He listened to the whole account and then went and knocked on the door of Harmon's room and explained, very quietly and with his hands relaxed at his sides, that the boarding house and everyone in it were considered by the better part of Harlan Creek to be worth protecting, and that it would be in everyone's interest if Harmon and his associates concluded their stay promptly. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there and communicated through some quality of stillness that he meant every word. Harmon and his men left the following morning. Cora knew that Graham had spoken to Harmon. Margaret Lyle had, of course, told her. And Cora came to find Graham at the livery that afternoon and stood in the wide doorway with her arms crossed and the winter light behind her and said, "I want you to know that I had handled the situation." "I know you had," Graham said. "He was working on a piece of bridle leather and he didn't put it down. I just wanted to make sure the door was locked behind him." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring something. "I don't need looking after," she said, and there was no anger in it, just the flat statement of a fact as she understood it. "No," he agreed, "you don't, but sometimes a locked door is still useful." Another silence. Then something shifted slightly in her expression, not quite a smile but the territory adjacent to one, and she said, "Thank you," and left. And he went back to his leather work and allowed himself exactly one moment of something that felt very much like hope before he put it away and returned to being sensible. He was 28 years old. She was 25. They were both too practical, too careful, too well acquainted with the cost of wanting things. But spring came, as it always does, and the world got warmer and Harlan Creek got greener, and people who had been keeping each other at a careful distance began to find reasons to be in the same place at the same time without quite admitting that was what they were doing. It was Margaret Lyle who began to take a hand in things, because Margaret Lyle was 70 years old and had long since moved past caring about being subtle. She arranged for Graham to join them for Sunday dinner with the cheerful, shameless efficiency of a general deploying troops, and she placed him directly across from Cora at the table and watched the two of them not look at each other, with the patient satisfaction of someone watching a long-overdue rain finally begin. Pearl sat beside Graham and told him at length about a book she was reading at school about the life of Abraham Lincoln, and Graham listened with genuine attention and asked questions that made Pearl think she was the most interesting person at the table, and Cora watched this happen and felt something unlock in her chest that she had kept locked for 3 years, something that frightened her with its warmth and its wanting. She told herself it was gratitude. That was safe. Gratitude made sense. The summer of 1883 was the summer that Cora began to talk to Graham. Not the brief, functional exchanges they'd had before, exchanges about wood stacking and ice on the road, and whether Pearl was welcome at the livery, but actual talking, the kind that takes up space and leads somewhere unexpected. It happened in small increments. A conversation on the boarding house porch after dinner, a walk to the creek on a Sunday afternoon that somehow included both Graham and Pearl, and then, the following Sunday, included them again. The conversations began to overlap and continue and refer back to earlier things, building a history between them the way a wall is built, stone by slow, deliberate stone. She told him about Kansas, about Elias, not in a way that was sorrowful but in the way a person speaks of someone they had loved honestly and lost honestly, with a grief that had been processed into something more manageable over time. Elias had been a good man, she said, and a hard worker, and not suited to the Kansas climate as it turned out, because the fever had taken him in 3 days in a way that had seemed almost aggressive in its efficiency. She had been 22. She had thought in those first months afterward that the grief would be a permanent condition. But grief, she had discovered, is like those boots she was wearing. It changes shape around the life you're living, becomes part of how you walk rather than what stops you from walking. Graham listened in the way he did everything, with his full attention and very few words, and she found she did not mind the silences between them. She had been surrounded her whole adult life with people who felt the need to fill every silence with something, and she had learned to be a little wary of that tendency, because, in her experience, a person who cannot abide quiet is often uncomfortable with what they'd have to think about if the noise stopped. Graham said, when she had finished, "He sounds like he was worth grieving." It was the precisely right thing to say, and he said it without any apparent awareness of how right it was, which made it more right still. She looked at him across the small distance of the boarding house porch and thought things she was not ready to say. He looked back at her with those storm-gray eyes and thought things he was not ready to say either. Pearl, sitting on the porch steps with a jar catching fireflies in the warm summer dark, was entirely unaware that the two adults behind her were conducting a conversation without any words, and had she known, she probably would have considered it excellent and necessary news, because Pearl had been deciding for some time that Graham Wallace was the sort of person who improved a situation. And she was only 8 years old, but she was her mother's daughter, and she understood things about people with a precision that was uncommon in someone her age. Autumn came and the conversations continued and became warmer and more comfortable and occasionally, unexpectedly funny, because Graham Wallace had a dry, quiet humor that came out sideways when least expected and made Cora laugh in a way that surprised her. A full, genuine laugh that she hadn't heard from herself in what felt like a long time. He made a remark one evening about the particular stubbornness of horses, and the particular stubbornness of mules, and the even more particular stubbornness of people who insisted on having opinions about whether one was preferable to the other. And she laughed until she had to put down her mending, and Pearl looked up from her schoolwork and said, "What?" And neither of them could explain it clearly enough to make it funny again, which made them both laugh harder. It was after that evening that Graham began to understand, with the clarity that sometimes comes when you stop trying to understand something and simply let yourself feel it instead, that he was in love with Cora Vaughn. Not the sudden lightning version of love that the novels talked about. Something slower and more certain than that. Something built from 3 years of noticing and listening, and being in the same place and choosing, again and again, to be honest with himself about what that meant. He was not sure what to do with this information. He was 28 and cautious by nature, and she had told him once, quietly and without apparent self-pity, that she had learned to be careful about what she let herself need, and he understood that impulse completely, and also understood that it could become a kind of prison if a person wasn't careful, and he did not want to be someone who reinforced the walls of that prison by failing to say something true. But he needed to find the right way. That was the thing with Graham. He was not impulsive. He thought things through, turned them around, considered the angles. He had learned from watching impulsive men on the range that a decision made in a hurry was usually a decision that needed remaking later, and he preferred to do things once and do them right. The third winter came. 1884. It arrived the way serious winters do in Wyoming, all at once and with a kind of authority that discouraged argument. And the boots were still on Cora's feet. Graham noticed them with a clarity that felt almost painful now, because he understood them differently at this point than he had understood them at first. They were not simply worn boots. They were the physical evidence of a woman who gave everything she had to her daughter and kept nothing back for herself, who repaired what could be repaired and made do with what remained when it couldn't be, who walked with her spine straight and her chin up through snow and ice and mud, and all the indignities of a life that required more labor than it offered reward, and who accepted all of this without complaint, because complaining was not a thing she had trained herself to do. He could feel the weight of them, not the boots themselves, but what they represented sitting in his chest like a stone he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. He went, one afternoon in December, to Garner's General Store, which was run by a man named Howard Garner, who had come to Harlan Creek from Philadelphia 15 years ago, and had long since abandoned all his Eastern pretensions, except for his habit of stocking a slightly more diverse selection of goods than you might expect to find in a Wyoming town of this size. Howard Garner stocked, in addition to the usual flour and salt and seed and ammunition, a small but respectable selection of women's boots that he ordered from a catalog twice a year on the theory that women had feet and feet needed boots, and there was no reason a woman in Wyoming should have to order her own boots if he could simply have them already. Graham spent a significant amount of time studying these boots with the same focused attention he gave to evaluating horseflesh, because he was not a man who did things carelessly, and he needed to get this right. He had spent some time over the past weeks working out Cora's boot size through the kind of careful, indirect observation that the situation required. He had watched her footprints in the mud outside the boarding house after a rain, and compared them to the boots in Garner's display with a geometric precision that would have made him feel somewhat foolish if he'd let himself think about it too much, but which he considered simply practical. He was fairly certain of the size. He was certain enough. He chose a pair that he thought would suit her. They were practical. She would not want anything impractical, good thick leather with solid stitching, and a heel height that was modest and sensible, and would hold up to Wyoming winters for several years if cared for properly. They were not fancy, but they were well made, and well made was what lasted. Howard Garner wrapped them in brown paper and put them in a box, and tied the box with a length of twine. And Graham carried the box out of the store and into the December afternoon, and stood for a moment on the porch of the general store, feeling a particular quality of nervous that he had not felt since he was a young man first learning to break horses, when the animal and the rider are both trying to figure out what the other intends, and neither one is certain yet that this is going to work out. He went to the boarding house that evening. He knocked at the door, and Margaret Lyle opened it with an expression that said she had been expecting something of this nature, and was entirely satisfied to see it manifesting. He asked if he might leave something for Cora, and Margaret took the box with both hands and a smile that contained a great deal of things she wisely did not say out loud. And Graham went back out into the cold December night, and was about 100 yards down the road when he stopped and stood there in the dark for a moment and breathed slowly and wondered if he'd done the right thing, and concluded that yes, he had, and walked the rest of the way back to the Fenner Ranch with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the stars. The box was on the kitchen table when Cora came down the next morning. Margaret Lyle was very busy with the stove and did not look up when Cora came in, which in itself was a communication of sorts, because Margaret Lyle was almost never genuinely occupied when she could be watchfully waiting for something interesting to happen. Cora looked at the box. There was nothing written on it, no note, no label, nothing. Just the box with its length of twine, sitting on the kitchen table in the early morning light. She sat down and untied the twine slowly and lifted the lid and found the boots inside, folded in the brown paper, and she sat there looking at them for a long time. She had not cried when Elias died. She had cried later, privately, after Pearl was asleep, when there was no one to see and nothing useful that the crying could do. She had not cried when she'd arrived in Harlan Creek and found her cousin gone. She had not cried when she'd counted her money in the room Margaret Lyle had given her and understood how few nights it could cover if the arrangement didn't hold. But she sat at that kitchen table looking at a pair of boots she had not asked for and could not have afforded, and that had been left for her without a note, without any expectation of acknowledgement, without any apparent desire for credit, and she felt something rise in her throat that was warm and tight and had more than a little water in it. Margaret Lyle, still very busy with the stove, said in a perfectly conversational tone, "Graham Wallace stopped by last evening." Cora looked at the boots. "Yes," she said after a moment, "I thought it might have been. He didn't stay, just left the box and went." Cora smoothed her thumb along the leather of the right boot, feeling the solid, honest quality of it. "How long," she said carefully, "would you say he has been noticing things?" Margaret Lyle set down her wooden spoon and turned from the stove and looked at Cora with the level, gentle gaze of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize what she's looking at. "I would say," she replied, "about 3 years, give or take." Cora sat with that. She looked at the boots and she thought about 3 years of someone seeing her and not performing the seeing, not making it into something she would have to respond to or manage or be grateful for on demand, just quietly, steadily paying attention, and then doing something about it in the most private, undemanding way imaginable. She thought about Graham Wallace and his still gray eyes and his dry humor, and the way he listened, and the way Pearl lit up when he came around, and the way the boarding house felt different when he was in it, steadier somehow, like a room that's been properly aired. She put the boots back in the box and got up from the table. "I'm going to return these," she said. Margaret Lyle's expression shifted into alarm. "After I've thanked him for them," Cora finished, "properly, in person." The alarm resolved back into the satisfied smile. "That seems right," Margaret Lyle said. It was a cold, clear December morning, the kind of Wyoming winter day where the sky is a color of blue so pure and deep it looks almost manufactured, And the snow on the ground has that particular crystalline quality that makes everything look like it's been made of something finer than it actually is. Cora walked to the Fenner ranch with the box under her arm and her heart conducting itself in a manner she found somewhat undignified, because she was 27 years old and she had lived a practical life, and she was not in the habit of letting her heart behave like something with no sense of decorum. But there it was. Graham was in the paddock when she arrived, working with a young horse that was still learning what it meant to have a person on its back, moving around it with that particular patient economy of motion that characterized everything he did. And she stopped at the fence and watched him for a moment before he saw her, because she wanted to look at him without his knowledge for once, after all the times he had apparently looked at her without hers. He was 30 years old. He moved like a man who was comfortable in his body and his work and his place in the world. Not a comfortable place exactly, but a known one. And there was something in that ease that she had been drawn to from the beginning without quite letting herself name the attraction. He was a man who did not perform himself for other people's benefit, and she had found in her experience that this was rarer than it should be. He saw her. He stilled for a moment, the way a person does when they see something unexpected and need a second to recalibrate. And then he moved to the fence and put his hands on the top rail and looked at the box under her arm with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She put the box on the fence rail between them and rested her own hands on it. "You forgot to leave a note." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure what to put in a note," he said. "You could have put your name. You knew it was me." "I did," she agreed, "but it might have been useful to have it in writing in case I wanted to be certain." He looked at her steadily. "Are you certain?" She held his gaze. "I've been watching the way you are with Pearl," she said. "The way you are with everyone around here, for that matter. The way you fixed the fence post without being asked. The way you dealt with Deck Harmon. The way you have been consistently, unswervingly decent in a place and a time when that is not always the path of least resistance." He did not say anything. "I have been," she continued, and now her voice was quieter, carrying more weight than volume, "very careful these past few years, for good reasons. I don't apologize for that." "No reason to apologize," he said. "But I have been so careful," she said, "that I think I may have been careless about something else entirely. Something that might matter quite a lot." She looked down at the box and then back up at him. "I cannot accept these boots." Something moved in his eyes. "Not as a gift from a person I don't know well," she continued. "But I find that I know you quite well, Graham Wallace, and I think I have for some time, and I was just too careful to admit it. So I am going to ask you something instead." He waited. "Would you like to come for Sunday dinner?" she said. "Not as someone Margaret Lyle has arranged for, as someone I've asked." The change in Graham Wallace's expression was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that happens in still water when something small but significant falls into it. A shift that moves outward from some quiet center and changes the whole surface. His eyes warmed to something that was not quite gray anymore, but something between gray and silver and the color the sky goes when the clouds clear. "Yes," he said, "I would like that." "Then bring the boots back with you Sunday," she said, and pushed the box toward him. "I'll accept them then." She turned and walked back toward town in the December light, and she did not look back. But she was smiling, and her spine was straight, and her left heel sank unevenly in the snow, and she was thinking that this would be the last winter that particular heel sank that particular way. Sunday came and Graham came with it, arriving at the boarding house with the box under his arm and his good coat on and his hat in his hand. And Pearl met him at the door and pulled him inside by the sleeve with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has already decided how a situation should proceed. Margaret Lyle had made a proper dinner, a roasted chicken, which was a significant and deliberate luxury, and sweet potatoes and bread, and a dried apple cake that filled the whole house with the smell of cinnamon and warmth. They sat around the table, the four of them, in the lamplight of the December afternoon, and the conversation moved through all its familiar channels and some new ones. And Graham made Pearl laugh twice and made Cora laugh once. And Margaret Lyle watched all of this with the composed satisfaction of someone watching a good thing begin. After dinner, Graham left the box with Cora, and she took it upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and put the boots on over her wool stockings. And they fit, which should not have surprised her as much as it did given everything she now understood about the quality of Graham Wallace's attention. But it did surprise her, and she sat there in those good warm boots in the lamplight of her room with a feeling in her chest that was so full it almost frightened her, and she let herself feel it anyway. Because she had earned it, and so had he. The winter deepened and the courtship, because that was what it had become, openly and without pretense deepened with it. Graham came to dinner on Sundays. He and Cora took to walking together in the evenings when the weather permitted, sometimes with Pearl between them and sometimes without, and the conversations they had in those winter walks covered territories that felt important, that felt like the kind of honest accounting of a person's interior life that you only undertake with someone you've decided to trust. He told her about his father, about growing up in Missouri and watching his father trust the wrong people and pay for it, and about the vow he'd made himself as a young man to be more careful, to do more watching and less leaping. He told her about coming west at 19 with a horse he'd half broken and a handful of skills and a great deal of determination, and working his way up through various ranches and various situations until he'd landed at the Fenner place and found it to his liking. He told her that he had been lonely sometimes, in the way that a person who is self-sufficient can be lonely, not for company in general, but for particular company, the kind that's hard to find. She listened with the full quality of attention that she recognized in him and was glad to discover she shared. And when he finished, she said, "I think being careful is not the same thing as being closed. I think there's a way to be both careful and open at the same time. It's just harder." "Yes," he said, "it is." "I think you do it," she said, "better than most." He stopped walking. They were on the road that ran west from town toward the creek, and the sky above them was full of winter stars, that particular dense, extravagant Wyoming starfield that never loses its power to silence a person. He turned and looked at her in the starlight and said, quietly and with no preamble, "Cora, I would very much like to court you properly, if you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment, this careful, decent, observant man, and felt the full, warm, unfrightening weight of what she felt for him, and said, "I think you have been courting me properly for 3 years, Graham. I'm saying yes now." He reached out then, slowly, and took her hand, and they stood there in the winter road under the Wyoming stars, holding hands for the first time, and it was such a simple thing that it should not have felt as large as it did, but it felt enormous. It felt like the kind of thing that changes the direction of everything that comes after, which of course it was. The winter of 1884 became the spring of 1885, and the courtship became the kind of public and open thing that a small town like Harlan Creek both watched with interest and took as its own particular property, because a town of that size cannot resist feeling personally involved in the romantic developments of its residents. People commented on it with varying degrees of subtlety. Roy Dunbar gave Graham a nod that conveyed congratulation and approval in equal measure. Old Pete Hawkins, cutting Graham's hair one Sunday, said, "I hear you've been walking with Cora Vaughn," in a tone that was purely interrogative, and Graham said yes, in a tone that was purely final, and Pete Hawkins seemed satisfied with this economy of communication. The person who was most unambiguously satisfied, of course, was Pearl, who had apparently been waiting with considerable patience for exactly this development, and who felt that her advocacy, however silent, for the general principle of Graham Wallace's worthiness had been thoroughly vindicated. She began referring to Graham as though he were already a fixed part of the household structure, the way you refer to a load-bearing wall, and Cora noticed this, and felt something in her chest pull with a warmth that had love and gratitude in it in equal measure. Graham proposed on a May evening in 1885, standing in the boarding house yard when the apple trees Margaret Lyle kept on the south side were in full ridiculous blossom, white flowers against the clear blue Wyoming evening sky. He had thought carefully about how to say what he wanted to say, and had concluded that the best approach was the simplest one, which was to be honest about what he felt without making it into a speech. He said, "I have been in love with you for some time, Cora. I haven't said it before now because I wanted to be sure of what I was offering before I offered it. I can offer you a life. Not a luxurious one, but a good one, with a man who intends to be faithful and hardworking and present, and who loves your daughter as though she were his own, which she might as well be as far as I'm concerned. I would like to marry you, if you'll have me." Cora stood in the apple blossom light and looked at this man who had left her boots in a box and repaired the fence post without being asked and stood in the snow with Deck Harmon, and said the right thing at the right moment with the right economy of words. And she said, "Graham Wallace, I have been in love with you since sometime last winter and have been managing this information with only moderate success. So yes, I will marry you." He took her face in his hands then, those calloused, careful hands, and kissed her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, thorough and honest and warm. And the apple trees shed their blossoms around them in the evening breeze in a way that would have seemed theatrical if it had been planned, and seemed perfect precisely because it wasn't. Pearl, who had been sitting on the porch steps with a book, looked up when they came back inside and looked at their faces and said, with 9-year-old directness, "Did you ask her?" Graham said. "I did." And she said yes. She did. Pearl nodded with the satisfaction of a person who had never doubted this would be the outcome. "Good," she said, and went back to her book. They were married in the church on the second Saturday of June, 1885. It was a warm, luminous Wyoming day, the kind of early summer day that makes the mountains look close enough to touch. Cora wore her good dress, dark blue with white collar and cuffs, and the boots Graham had left for her the previous December, and she had never felt more herself than she did walking down the aisle of that pine-smelling church with Graham at the front of it looking at her with those gray eyes that had found her, and held her for years without her fully knowing it until it was already everything. Pearl served as her attendant, solemn and proud, and very beautiful in a white dress that Margaret Lyle had made for her with considerable skill and satisfaction. Margaret Lyle sat in the front row and did not cry because she was Margaret Lyle, who did not do such things, but her handkerchief was in her hand the entire service, which communicated something. Roy Dunbar, in his dual capacity as sheriff and postmaster, witnessed the ceremony alongside half the town of Harlan Creek, and afterward there was a dinner in the yard of the boarding house with tables set up in the grass and food brought by everyone who had come, because this was how Harlan Creek did things, communally, and with a thoroughness that suggested the whole town felt its own stake in the matter. Harlan Fenner, Graham's employer, attended with his wife Dorothea and shook Graham's hand with the grip of a man who is genuinely pleased and said, "About time," which Graham accepted as the compliment it was intended to be. They moved into Graham's cabin at the edge of the Fenner property, which was small 2 rooms, which required some creative arrangement of their combined possessions, but solid and warm and built with the same honest attention Graham brought to everything. He had spent the previous month adding a room onto the back of the cabin for Pearl, a small but proper room with a window that looked east toward the mountains, and Pearl had stood in this room on her first morning in it and looked at the mountains in the early light and said nothing for a long time in a way that communicated everything. The first months of their marriage were the kind of months that leave a permanent mark on a person's understanding of what life can be. Not because extraordinary things happened. The extraordinary things had already happened, the falling in love and the asking and the answering. What happened now was the ordinary, and Graham and Cora were both people who had spent enough time without the right ordinary that they understood its extraordinary value. Graham came home from the range in the evening smelling of horses and grass and the particular outdoor smell of a day's work. And Cora had supper made, because she had taken on the cooking that had previously been Margaret Lyle's domain, and they sat at the small table in the lamplight and talked about the day and about Pearl and about the Fenner Ranch and about whatever had come up in town when Cora went in for supplies. And it was the kind of conversation that builds a shared world between two people. Brick by steady brick, Pearl flourished in a way that Cora watched with a private, deep gratitude that sometimes caught in her throat when she wasn't expecting it. Pearl had always been resilient and capable, but there was a quality to her now that hadn't been there before, a lightness, something eased, as though a weight she'd been too young to name but old enough to feel had been lifted from her. She took to calling Graham Papa with a naturalness that had been her own initiative, not suggested or encouraged, simply adopted because it was accurate to her understanding of what he was. Graham's response to this had been entirely private, but Cora had seen his face the first time Pearl said it. They were at the breakfast table and Pearl had said, "Papa, Tolliver looked at me funny this morning when I gave him his apple. What does it mean when a horse makes that face?" And Graham had looked at the table for exactly 3 seconds before he looked up at Pearl and answered the question with complete composure. And later that evening, when Pearl was asleep, he had told Cora quietly that he didn't think he'd ever been given a finer gift and that he intended to honor it. Cora had taken his hand across the table. "You already are," she said. The summer passed and autumn came. And with the autumn came news from further west that Cora listened to with a growing awareness of the larger world her small life existed within. The cattle industry was changing. The railroads were pushing further and reshaping everything in their wake, and the Wyoming Territories were in the middle of their push toward statehood that would eventually succeed in 1890. The range was changing, the open land being fenced and parceled, and this had consequences for men like Graham, whose work existed in the space between settled civilization and open range. Graham understood the change was coming. He had watched it coming for years, had conversations with Harlan Fenner about what it meant for the ranch and for the people who worked it. Fenner was not a young man. He was in his late 60s, and he had 2 sons who had gone east for education and had not come back. And this was a common enough story in Wyoming in 1885 that it had its own particular texture of sadness. Harlan Fenner came to Graham in October of that year with a proposition that Graham brought home and laid on the table between himself and Cora, and discussed with her as he discussed everything important, completely and without withholding. Fenner wanted to sell the ranch. Not to some eastern speculator who would cut it up and fence it to death, but to someone who would work it and maintain it and carry what it was forward. He had decided, he told Graham, that the right person was standing in front of him, and that he was prepared to offer the property at a price that was within reach of a man who had saved carefully and worked honestly for 5 years, and who could arrange a modest bank loan for the remainder. The price was fair, more than fair. It was the kind of offer a man makes when he cares about what happens to a thing more than he cares about maximizing his return on it. Graham sat with this for 3 days before he told Cora because he needed to understand what he thought about it before he could talk about it, and when he told her she listened to the whole thing without speaking and then said, "Do you want it?" "Yes," he said. "Is it achievable?" "I believe so." She looked at the table and then at him. "Then I think you should take it," she said. "I think we should take it." The "we" landed between them like something solid and true, and Graham looked at his wife across their small table in their small cabin in the Wyoming autumn night, and felt the specific, grateful, almost aching quality of a man who has been given more than he expected from his life, and knows it. The arrangements took several months of the sort of careful, methodical work that Graham was built for meetings with the bank in Cheyenne, consultations with the small lawyer in Harlan Creek who handled the territory's land transactions, A thorough review of the ranch's accounts and liabilities that Graham conducted with the same focused precision he applied to everything. Harlan Fenner moved in the spring of 1886 to a smaller house in Cheyenne to be near his oldest son, who had established himself there, and he shook Graham's hand on his last morning at the Fenner ranch and said, in the way of an old man who has spent a lifetime building and is choosing his successor with care, "Take care of it." "I will," Graham said. And the ranch became the Wallace Ranch, which was a fact that Graham did not entirely believe for the first several weeks of its being true, and which Cora took to with the efficient competence that characterized her approach to everything, immediately establishing herself as the kind of rancher's wife who was a genuine operational partner rather than a decorative presence. She had grown up on a farm in Kansas, and she knew land and she knew livestock, and she brought these knowledges to bear on the ranch in a way that Graham both relied on and admired, and the two of them working side by side established something in the first year of ranch ownership that was the practical expression of everything their marriage was in the abstract, a partnership of equal capabilities in service of a shared enterprise. Pearl, now 11 years old, became a feature of the ranch in the way that children become features of the places they love, absorbed into the daily texture of it. She had taken up riding with an aptitude that surprised no one who knew her, because Pearl Vaughn was a person who applied herself fully to whatever she was doing, and she and Tolliver, who Graham had given her, in fact what he had been giving her in spirit for years, developed the particular horse-and-rider relationship that is built on mutual understanding and considerable trust. The Wyoming Territory was changing around them, and they were changing with it, and the changes were not all easy or comfortable, but they were navigated with the shared intelligence and steady mutual reliance that had come to characterize the way Graham and Cora Wallace did everything together. The winter of 1886 was brutal, historically so. It was the winter that broke many ranchers across the territory, a wall of cold that came down from Canada with a fury that the animals and the people had no adequate preparation for. The Wallace Ranch lost cattle. Not as many as some of their neighbors lost, because Graham had brought the herd in early based on a quality of reading the weather that was born from years of experience, but enough to constitute a significant setback, and they came out of that winter counting costs and counting blessings with equal care. What they found doing this counting was that they had more blessings than costs, which was not nothing in the winter of 1887. They had the ranch, which they owned, which was a kind of security that Cora had never had in Kansas with the mortgaged farm, and the permanence of it was something she felt in her body on certain mornings when she looked out across the snowy fields from the kitchen window with her coffee and understood that this ground was theirs and would still be theirs tomorrow. They had Pearl, who had come through the harsh winter with her characteristic resilience, and who was emerging at 12 into a young woman of considerable intelligence and character, the kind of person who would clearly be someone significant, though in what field exactly remained to be seen. And they had each other, which was the largest and most foundational of the blessings, and the one that Cora returned to most often in the quiet of her own reflections, because she had known what it was to be without it, and the comparison made the having of it vivid in a way that she hoped never became ordinary. It was in the spring of 1887, when the Wyoming Territory was beginning to find its footing again after the devastating winter, that Cora told Graham she was expecting their first child. She told him in the early morning before Pearl was up, while Graham was at the stove making coffee because he was always the first awake and he had taken on the morning coffee as his particular domain. She sat down at the table and said, "Graham," in a tone that made him turn, and she said it without preamble because she had no patience for preamble on something this significant. "We're going to have a baby." He put down the coffee pot. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled her to him with both arms, and she felt his heart beating hard against her ear, and he said nothing for a long moment, nothing at all, and then he said very quietly, "Are you well?" "Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling entirely well," she said, her voice muffled in his shoulder. "Good," he said. "Good, that's good." She could feel him smiling even though she couldn't see his face. "A baby," he said, as though the word itself needed consideration. "Our baby," she confirmed. He held her tighter. "Cora," he said, and there was something in his voice that was full of something it was too big to contain. Something that a man who was better with silence than words still needed to say without quite knowing how. And she understood it completely and pressed her hand against his chest where his heart was and said, "I know." The pregnancy was healthy. The summer of 1887 was warm and beautiful, and the ranch settled into a productive rhythm that included the gradual swelling of Cora's presence and the gradual accumulation of small preparations for the new arrival. Graham built a cradle in the evenings, working in the lamplight with the careful, loving attention he brought to everything, and Cora watched him sand the wood smooth and fit the joints together, and felt a warmth that was so large it sometimes made her eyes sting. Pearl was openly delighted about the baby in the uncomplicated way of young people who have not yet learned to be careful about their delight. She asked questions with relentless thoroughness and read about infant care in the one book on the subject available in the Harlan Creek Lending Library with the same focused attention she applied to her schoolwork. And she informed both Graham and Cora of various facts she had gleaned in a tone that combined authority and enthusiasm in a ratio that they both found entirely endearing. The baby was born in October of 1887, a boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's serious expression, who announced his arrival into the world with a voice that suggested he had opinions and would be sharing them. They named him Eli, for Cora's late husband, who had been Pearl's father, and for the continuity of memory and love that Cora believed was owed to those who come before, and Graham had agreed to this without hesitation, which was another thing she loved about him, his capacity for generosity toward the whole of her history, not just the part of it that included him. Eli Wallace was a healthy, strong, thoroughly inconvenient baby, in the way that good babies often are demanding and loud and requiring everything of everyone, and giving back, in return, the specific, transformative gift of unconditional new life that makes all the inconvenience utterly beside the point. Graham held his son with a care that was palpable, that particular quality of tenderness that some people don't discover in themselves, until they have something very small and very new to direct it toward. And Cora watched her husband with their son, and felt that the fullness in her chest had reached a level beyond which it was going to need a different container entirely. Pearl held her baby brother with a gravity and precision that suggested she had indeed read the relevant literature, and informed them that she would teach him to read before he was 4 and to ride before he was 5, which both Graham and Cora considered entirely credible. The years that followed were the years of building, of watching the ranch grow and the family grow, and the life they had made together accumulate the kind of depth and texture that comes only with time. The territory became the state of Wyoming in July of 1890, which was a matter of considerable local celebration, and Graham and Cora and Pearl and Eli rode into Harlan Creek for the public festivities, with the particular pride of people who feel that the place they're living in has been given its proper recognition. It was in this same year of 1890 that a question of injustice came home to Graham Wallace in a direct and personal way that he had not anticipated, but perhaps should have. A man named Hollis Crane, who had acquired land to the north of the Wallace ranch through methods that the territory had permitted but that common decency would not have, came to Graham with a proposal that was dressed in the language of opportunity but was in its substance a demand that Graham sell him the eastern portion of the Wallace land, the portion that bordered the creek and gave the ranch its water access, at a price that Hollis Crane had decided was adequate without consulting anyone else's opinion on the matter. Graham listened to the whole proposal without expression and then said no. Crane was not accustomed to being told no. He was a man who had made his way in the Wyoming Territory by identifying what other people needed and placing himself between them and it. And he had been effective at this because the territory, in its earlier years, had not always had the legal infrastructure to prevent such maneuvers. But this was 1890 and Wyoming was a state now, and the law was more settled than it had been. And Graham Wallace was a man who had done everything correctly and held good title to his land and had Roy Dunbar, who was still sheriff, and the law on his side. Crane made 3 more attempts, the last of which included something that could be interpreted either as an offer or as a threat, depending on how charitable you felt toward the intentions of a man who had never demonstrated that charitable intentions were available in his repertoire. Graham drove to Cheyenne and spoke to a lawyer and wrote a letter to the relevant authorities and came home and told Cora the whole story at the kitchen table that evening. Cora listened and said, "He thinks you'll back down because you've got too much to lose." "Yes," Graham said. "He's wrong," she said. "I know," he said. They looked at each other across the table, this table that had hosted so many conversations of the kind that build a marriage, that build a life, and Cora said, "We hold the line," with the same quality of calm certainty she had used on Deck Harmon in the boarding house hallway 8 years ago, and Graham felt the familiar combination of admiration and love that she reliably produced in him and said, "Yes." They held the line. Holly's Crane eventually found easier targets elsewhere, as men of his particular character generally do, when they discover that the object of their attention is more trouble than profit, and the Wallace Ranch retained its eastern border and its creek access, and continued in its reliable, productive way. The creek became a landmark of their family life in the years that followed, where Pearl first swam without assistance at 13 and caught her first fish at 14, and where Eli learned to skip stones with a seriousness of purpose that made his parents exchange looks of private amusement, because Eli Wallace was a very serious child and brought this seriousness to everything including stone skipping, which he approached as though it were a discipline requiring mastery. Pearl grew into exactly the person those early years had promised. She was 17 in 1892, and had taken over the management of the ranch's account books with a precision and capability that made Graham declare, with complete honesty and some pride, that she was better at it than he was. She had plans. She wanted to study. She had been corresponding through the mail with a women's college in Denver that had started an extension program, and she brought this correspondence to the kitchen table one evening in May with the composed determination of a young woman who has decided what she wants and is simply ascertaining whether the path to it is available. Graham and Cora read the correspondence together, and Cora reached across the table and took Pearl's hand, and Graham said, "If this is what you want, Pearl, we will find a way to make it possible." And they had said it together, and meant it together. And Pearl's face had done something then that she generally did not permit it to do in front of other people. It had shown everything that was in it, the gratitude and the relief and the love. And for a moment she had looked like the 5-year-old girl in the Kansas street, who had trusted her mother when there was nothing but trust to hold them both. Pearl went to Denver in the autumn of 1892 at the age of 17. Which was old enough and capable enough and determined enough that neither Graham nor Cora felt any serious misgiving about it, though the cabin was quieter without her in a way that they both noticed and did not mention for the first few weeks, because some silences need to be lived in before they can be spoken about. She wrote letters. Thorough, detailed, Pearl-style letters that arrived with reliable frequency, and described her studies and her fellow students, and the life of Denver with the same focused precision she brought to everything. She had, it emerged, a particular aptitude for mathematics and bookkeeping that her professors found remarkable, and this news made Graham smile at the breakfast table in a way that Cora recognized as the specific, warm, deeply private pride of a parent. Eli, growing and changing with the speed that small boys employ without any apparent awareness that their parents are watching and trying to keep up, was 7 years old by 1894 and had developed a personality that was somewhat at odds with his solemn infant self. He was, it turned out, a cheerful child, easy in the world and curious about everything in it, with a gift for making friends and a relationship with horses that resembled his mother's relationship with work. Which was to say devoted and entirely natural. He was going to be a rancher. There was no question about it in anyone's mind, including his own. Graham watched his son with the horses and thought about his own beginning, that young man from Missouri with the half-broken horse and the handful of skills. And the distance between that beginning and this present moment was so large that it sometimes required him to sit with it quietly before he could hold it all at once. He was 40 years old in 1894. He did not feel like 40, or rather, he felt like 40 in the best possible sense, seasoned, settled, in possession of his own life in a way that young people are not, because young people don't yet know what they have. He had calluses on his hands and gray coming in at his temples, and a scar on his right forearm from a wire fence incident in the bad winter of '86. And he had a wife who knew him completely, and a son who was becoming a person worth knowing, and a daughter who was making her own extraordinary way in the world, and a ranch that was theirs free and clear and productive and good. He came home one evening in October of 1894 to find Cora at the kitchen table with something in her expression that he had learned over 9 years of marriage to read with considerable accuracy, and he sat down across from her and said, "Tell me." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had not changed in any essential way from the eyes that had watched him stack firewood against the south wall 14 years ago, and said, "Another baby." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "Are you well?" he said, because this was always the first thing. This would always be the first thing. "I'm very well," she said, and she was smiling, the full smile that still had the capacity to make his chest do the thing it had been doing since the first time he properly saw it. Surprised, but very well. "Good," he said. Their second child, a girl they named Hazel after Graham's mother, arrived in the spring of 1895, loud and red-faced and apparently convinced that the world needed to be informed immediately of her arrival. She was a large, vigorous baby who slept in sudden decisive bursts and was awake for the rest of the time with an attention and appetite that made her brother's infancy seem retrospectively peaceful. Eli regarded his sister with a mixture of fascination and caution that resolved, within the first few months, into a devoted and proprietary affection that would characterize their relationship for the rest of their lives. Pearl came home from Denver for the summer that year, changed in visible ways and unchanged in the ways that mattered, and she held her baby sister with the same careful precision she had brought to everything since the age of 9, and looked at Hazel's face with such open, uncomplicated love that Cora had to turn away for a moment to collect herself, because 20 years of loving this particular person had done nothing to reduce the force of it. Pearl had made a friend in Denver, she said casually over supper one evening, a young man named Thomas Abernethy who was studying law at a college nearby, and the particular quality of casual she used when she said it communicated something entirely other than casual to both Graham and Cora, who exchanged a glance across the table that contained an entire conversation. That autumn Pearl went back to Denver, and the correspondence continued with its usual frequency, and the letters began to include occasional references to Thomas Abernethy that became less casual over time as Pearl either forgot or decided she didn't care to maintain the pretense, and eventually a letter arrived in the winter that said Thomas had expressed his intention to call on Graham the following spring. Graham read this letter twice at the kitchen table with his coffee growing cold beside him, and Cora watching him from the stove with an expression of careful neutrality that was, he knew, covering a great deal of amusement, and he said finally, "She's 20 years old." Cora said, "and she's clearly thought this through." "She has clearly thought this through," Cora agreed, "in the way that Pearl thinks everything through, which is to say thoroughly and from multiple angles." He looked at the letter again. He thought about Pearl at 5 years old reaching for her mother's hand in the street. Pearl at 8 feeding Tolliver apple cores through the fence with both hands. Pearl at 13 in her room with the east-facing window, looking at the mountains in the early morning light without saying anything. "I'll meet with him," Graham said, which surprised no one because what else would he have done? Thomas Abernethy came to the Wallace Ranch in May of 1895. A serious and earnest young man of 23, with an honest face and good manners, and an obvious and unfeigned regard for Pearl that made itself apparent in the first 10 minutes of his acquaintance with her family. Graham took him out to look at the ranch in the afternoon, the two of them walking the fence line along the eastern border with the creek visible beyond it. And Graham asked the questions that needed asking and listened to the answers with the full quality of attention he gave to everything, and concluded that Thomas Abernethy was not a man performing goodness, but a man who was genuinely attempting it, which was the best that could be said about anyone. He gave his blessing, such as it was, Pearl being Pearl. She would have made her own decision regardless, but the blessing mattered to her, and to Graham, and giving it was one of the more quietly significant things he did that year. Pearl and Thomas Abernethy were engaged by the end of 1895, and Cora sat with this news in the private way she sat with large things, turning it around in the lamplight of her own reflections, and felt the particular compound emotion of a mother whose child is becoming themselves in the fullest possible sense, pride and love, and a tenderness so acute it was almost painful, and something else underneath it all, something that was gratitude toward the arc of it, toward the whole long curve from that Kansas street to this Wyoming evening, from worn boots and careful hope to this full, warm, improbable life. She found Graham in the paddock the following morning, leaning on the fence watching Eli put one of the young horses through its paces with the competent ease of a 9-year-old who has been around horses his whole life, and she stood beside him and leaned on the fence too, and they watched Eli together in the morning light. "She's happy," Cora said. "Yes," Graham said. "Are you all right with it?" He was quiet for a moment. "She came to Harlan Creek with nothing but you and a carpetbag," he said, "and now she's a young woman with a life of her own that she's built largely herself. I think that's something worth being more than all right with." Cora leaned into him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they watched their son on the young horse in the October morning, and the mountains beyond were the same purple they had always been, and the sky was that deep, clear, Wyoming blue, and the world smelled of grass and horses and cold, clean air, and everything that needed to be said was already between them in the silence, held there as easily as breathing. Eli called something from across the paddock, some horse-related question that required immediate paternal input, and Graham called back an answer, and then looked down at Cora with those storm-gray eyes that had never entirely lost their quality of approaching weather, the kind of weather that turns out to be not a storm at all but a change in season, something permanent and good. "There are still things I notice," he said conversationally, "that I don't always say out loud." She looked up at him. "Tell me one," he considered. "I notice," he said, "that you still make your coffee too strong and your bread not strong enough." She laughed. "That is not what I meant." "I know what you meant," he said, and held her tighter for a moment. "You are still the most exactly right person I have ever met," he said, quietly and directly, in the way he said things he meant. "I notice that every day. I don't say it as often as I think it." Cora Von Wallace, 38 years old, standing in the October morning on the ranch that was theirs, with her son on a horse across the paddock and her husband's arm around her shoulders, and her daughter promised to a good man and her baby daughter beginning to pull herself upright on the furniture inside the house, looked at this man, and thought about worn boots and brown paper boxes and a December morning at a kitchen table in a boarding house, and all the long road from there to here, every foot of it earned, every step of it real. Graham, she said, yes, I notice things too that I don't always say. Tell me one, he said, giving her her own words back. She was quiet for a moment, feeling the fullness of it, the whole accumulated weight of it, the years and the children and the ranch and the hard winters and the good summers and the table conversations and the fence-line walks and all the daily ordinary that had built itself, stone by patient stone, into a life that was more than she had known to hope for. I notice, she said, that you have never once in all the time I've known you done anything solely for the credit of it. Not the wood stacked against the south wall, not the fence post, not Deck Harmon, not the boots. She looked at him steadily. Not any of it. You have always done things because they were the right thing to do and then moved on. I noticed that. I have noticed it since the beginning. It is still the most extraordinary thing about you. He looked at her for a long moment with those eyes, and she felt the full force of being seen by someone who has been seeing you clearly for 15 years and has not once looked away. Cora, he said. Yes. I love you, he said, simple and complete and without any qualification or diminishment. I know, she said. I love you too. Eli's horse chose this moment to express an opinion about something loudly, and the spell broke in the way spells do when life insists on continuing, and Graham moved toward the paddock and Cora moved toward the house where Hazel would need tending, and the morning got on with itself in the reliable, ordinary, extraordinary way of mornings on a Wyoming ranch in the last decade of the 19th century. Pearl's wedding was held the following June on the ranch itself, in the yard where the grass had come in thick and green with the spring rains, with the mountains in the distance, and the sky that particular impossible blue. She wore white, and she was beautiful in the uncomplicated, specific way of a person who is entirely themselves on the most significant day of their life thus far. And she walked to Thomas Abernethy across the grass with her mother's composure, and her mother's straight spine, and something all her own in her face, some quality of joyful certainty that was entirely Pearl and always had been. Cora gave her daughter's hand to Thomas Abernethy and turned to find Graham beside her, and she took his hand without looking because, after 15 years, she knew exactly where he would be, and he held it through the ceremony with the steady, quiet warmth that was the substance of who he was. The years continued, as years do, with their accumulation of ordinary events that are in fact extraordinary when considered closely enough. Eli grew up and grew into himself and became, as promised, a rancher of skill and instinct, taking on more of the daily operation of the Wallace Ranch as Graham passed 50 and found certain physical aspects of the work appropriately delegable. Hazel grew into a spirited and independent young woman who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's composure and Pearl's intellectual ambition, and she decided at 16 that she wanted to be a teacher, which seemed both entirely surprising and entirely inevitable depending on which moment of her childhood you were remembering. Pearl and Thomas had 2 children of their own in Denver, both of whom were brought to the Wallace Ranch for summers and holidays, and who learned to ride on the Wallace horses, and were taught by their grandmother Cora to make bread the proper way, and by their grandfather Graham to read weather and horses with equal respect. Margaret Lyle, who had been 70 when Cora arrived in Harlan Creek, and who had defied all reasonable expectations by continuing to exist and to run her boarding house with iron efficiency, finally closed the boarding house in 1898 at the age of 88, at which point she came to live at the Wallace Ranch, where she held court from a chair on the porch and dispensed observations about the world with the authority of someone who had been watching it for a very long time. She died in her sleep in 1900, peacefully and without having been, as far as anyone could tell, troubled by anything in her final years, which was exactly the ending she had deserved. Harlan Creek grew and changed in the way that towns grow and change at the turn of a century, and the Wallace Ranch grew with it, adding acreage in 1896, when the neighboring property came available and Graham and Cora decided, at the kitchen table over a lamplit evening, to take the risk. And it proved to be the right decision, as the decisions made together at that table generally did. Graham Wallace turned 50 in 1904, and Cora threw him a party that he did not ask for, and did not want, and was moved by in a way he could not have anticipated, because the people who came were the full accounting of a life well-lived. Eli, 20 years old, and already the kind of steady, capable young man that made his parents feel they had done at least this part of things correctly. Hazel, 9 years old and full of questions she expected answered. Pearl and Thomas with their 2 children from Denver, various Harlan Creek neighbors and friends accumulated over 24 years of being part of a place. Roy Dunbar, who had finally retired from his dual role as sheriff and postmaster and was now approximately as old as the territory felt, and the whole ordinary, extraordinary cast of a life that had been built slowly and honestly in the Wyoming mountains. Graham stood in the yard of his ranch on his 50th birthday in the summer evening light and looked at all of it, the faces and the land and the mountains beyond, and felt the specific quality of gratitude that is available only to a person who has known both the absence and the presence of something, and can therefore measure the difference accurately. Cora found him standing there a little apart from the party and came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her and they looked at the mountains and the sky going orange and pink over the western peaks, and she said, "What are you thinking?" He thought about it honestly. "I'm thinking about boots," he said. She looked at him with those dark eyes. "Worn boots," he said, "and a December morning, and a woman who wore the same boots for 3 winters without once suggesting that the world owed her better." "The world didn't owe me better," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I wanted to give you better anyway." She leaned into him. The party went on around them, their children and their neighbors, and the warm Wyoming evening, and the mountains were purple in the last light, and the creek beyond the eastern fence was catching the fading gold of the sky. "Graham," she said, "yes, you have given me the best life I know how to imagine." He held her tighter. "You built it with me," he said. "We built it together," she corrected. "Yes," he said, "we did." The evening settled into full dark, and someone lit lanterns in the yard, and the party went on, and Graham Wallace and Cora Von Wallace stood in the lamplight of their 50th year, and the 24th year of knowing each other, and the 19th year of being married, and all of it, every cold winter and long summer, every difficult decision and quiet good morning and lamplight conversation and fence-line walk, every year of Pearl growing and Eli learning and Hazel arriving and laughing and growing. Every year of the ranch and the mountains and the Wyoming sky, all of it was contained in the simple, steady fact of standing here together, which had been the point of everything from the beginning. The boots that Graham had left in a box on a December morning in 1884 had long since worn out in their turn and been replaced, and the ones after them had worn out too, and the ones after those, and Cora had worn through boots with the same efficient thoroughness she brought to everything, walking the life that she and Graham had made together with the same straight spine and level gaze she had brought to that first icy street in Harlan Creek. But somewhere in a trunk at the back of their bedroom closet, the original box remained, empty and brown-papered, the twine still wrapped around it in the careful knot Graham had tied one December afternoon in 1884 when he was a man who knew what he felt and had found, finally, the right way to say it without saying anything at all. Cora knew it was there. She had put it there herself, years ago, and kept it, the way you keep the things that mark the turning points, the before and after moments of a life. The box itself was nothing. It was what it had contained, and what the containing of it had said, that mattered. A man who saw you. A man who had been seeing you quietly and faithfully for 3 winters without saying so, and who had found the way to tell you that was so perfectly calibrated to who you were, no pity, no performance, just a practical, tender, wholly private act of care, that it had unlocked something in her she had not known was still lockable. She had thought she was past being unlocked, after Elias, after Kansas, after all the careful years of managing alone. She had thought she had arrived at a version of herself that was complete without that particular kind of completion. She had been wrong, which was one of the best things she had ever been wrong about. The party went on into the warm Wyoming night, and Eli told a story that made everyone laugh, including his father, and Hazel fell asleep on the porch in the way children fall asleep at parties, completely and without warning, and Pearl and Thomas Abernethy sat close together on the bench by the south fence with the lantern light on their faces, and Margaret Lyle would have said something sharp and fond about all of it if she'd been there. And the mountains were dark against a sky full of stars that were exactly as extravagant and indifferent and beautiful as they had always been. And the creek ran over its stones in the darkness with the sound that water makes when it has been running over the same stones for a very long time, and intends to go on running over them for a very long time more. Graham Wallace, 50 years old, stood in the yard of his ranch with his wife at his side and looked at his children and his grandchildren and the life they had built, and thought, with the clarity that sometimes descends when everything is exactly as it should be, that this was what a life looked like when you did it right, not perfectly, not without cost, not without the winters that nearly broke you and the losses that marked you permanently, and the 1,000 ordinary days that asked everything of you without announcing themselves as significant, but right, in the fundamental sense, right in the way that means you showed up and told the truth and stayed when staying was called for, and acted when action was required, and loved the people worth loving with the full and honest weight of your whole self. He turned and kissed Cora's temple, and she turned her face into it the way she had been turning her face into these quiet gestures for 19 years, with a completeness of trust that still, even now, struck him as the finest gift he had ever been given. "Come inside," she said, soft and warm against his cheek. "The night's getting cold." "In a minute," he said. He wanted one more minute of this, of standing here with the mountains and the stars and the ranch that was theirs and the children who were theirs and the woman who was his partner in every way a person can mean that word, the complete and fully accounted life of Graham Wallace of Harlan Creek, Wyoming, who had once been a young man from Missouri with a half-broken horse and a handful of skills, and who had become this. "All right," Cora said, and she did not pull away, she simply stayed, the way she had always stayed, steady and present and entirely herself. 1 minute became 2, became the kind of moment that extends itself as long as the people in it are willing to hold it, and they held it a little longer, the two of them, under the Wyoming stars. Then they went inside.